They thought he was just a preacher, a man of words, not war, a teacher, not a threat. So they watched him speak, they watched people gather, they watched influence grow, and they did nothing until the day the movement stopped asking for change and began enforcing it. By then, it was already too late. I tell stories history softened. Subscribe if this kind of truth matters.
At the turn of the 19th century, northern Nigeria was not a vacuum of power. It was structured, layered, established. The Hausa states, kingdoms like Gobir, Kano, and Katsina, believed they understood their world. They controlled trade, they managed taxation, they enforced authority through courts, armies, and tradition. To them, stability meant control, and control meant permanence. Religion was already present. Islam had been part of the region for centuries, but it existed alongside older practices shaped by politics, compromise, and local realities. Rulers believed they could balance both. They believed they were in charge of the narrative. And then came a man who refused to compromise.
Usman Fodio was not born into rebellion. He was a scholar, a teacher, a voice within the system, not outside it. He preached reform, not revolution. At first, his message was simple but disruptive, that power had drifted, that leadership had become performative, that rulers claimed Islam but governed without its discipline. And people listened. Not just the poor, not just the marginalized. Even those within the system began to question it. Because Fodio wasn't offering chaos, he was offering clarity. And clarity is dangerous. Movements don't become dangerous overnight. They become dangerous when they begin to reorganize loyalty. Fodio's following grew not as a mob, but as a network. Scholars, students, communities. A parallel structure was forming, not declared, but understood. Authority was no longer flowing only from the throne. It was beginning to flow from belief, and belief does not require permission. The rulers of Gobe saw it, but they misread it. They thought it was influence. They didn't realize it was infrastructure. Power rarely collapses without warning, but warnings are often ignored. Tension between Fodio and the ruler of Gobia had been building. Restrictions were imposed. Pressure increased. At one point, an assassination attempt was reported. The message was clear: stay within the system or be removed from it. But by then, Fodio was no longer just a scholar within the system. He had become something else. In 1804, he made a decision that changed everything. He declared a jihad, not as an act of impulse, but as a strategic shift from influence to enforcement. The rulers believed they were suppressing dissent. What they had done was trigger a transformation. The Hausa rulers had armies, they had experience, they had precedent, but they had blind spots. They underestimated belief as a mobilizing force. They assumed loyalty would remain tied to political structures. They believed rebellion would look like chaos. But this was not chaos. This was organized, disciplined, motivated by ideology, not just survival. And that changes how people fight. The rulers were defending territory. Fodio's movement was redefining it. The early confrontations were not decisive, but momentum was. Each victory did more than shift land. It shifted perception. More people joined, more leaders defected, more territories fell. The structure that once looked permanent began to fracture, not because it lacked force, but because it lacked alignment. Usman Fodio's forces were not just expanding, they were replacing. replacing systems, replacing authority, replacing legitimacy. And once legitimacy shifts, power follows.
By the time the movement stabilized, it was no longer just a rebellion. It was a state. The Sokoto Caliphate emerged, one of the largest political structures in West African history. Governance was restructured, leadership was redistributed. Islamic law became central, not symbolic. The rulers who once believed they controlled the system were no longer part of it. What had started as reform had become replacement.
Power does not just change structures, it changes stories. The new system needed legitimacy. It framed the past as deviation and the present as correction. But history is rarely that clean. Some saw justice, others saw disruption. Some experienced order, others experienced loss. Historians debate aspects of this period, but the structural shift in power is undeniable. A movement had succeeded in doing what few do. It didn't just challenge authority, it redefined it. Today, the story of Usman Fodio lives in multiple forms: as a reformer, as a revolutionary, as a builder of systems. But beneath all interpretations lies a quieter truth. Power is rarely lost in a single moment. It erodes when those who hold it misread what is changing beneath them. The Hausa rulers believed they understood their world. They believed influence could be contained. They believed time was on their side. They were wrong. Because by the time they recognized the shift, it was no longer a movement. It was a new reality. Power is never as permanent as it believes. More stories like this? Subscribe.